Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to the 17th meeting of the Referendum Scotland Bill Committee. First item on the agenda this morning is whether to take an item in private. This item concerns the committee's next meeting, when the main item will be to review all of the evidence we've had so far on the referendum bill, obviously to give a steer to the clerks to help us form the Stage 1 report. Do we agree that it would be appropriate to take that particular item in private? Thank you, colleagues. That takes us to the second item on the agenda, which is the main item on today's agenda. And I give a warm welcome to Nicola Sturgeon, the Deputy First Minister, and who is supported by three government officials: Steve Sadler, the head of the elections team; Helen Clifford, who's the bill team leader; Graham Fisher, who's the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. Deputy First Minister, I don't know if you want to make an open statement or not. If you do, then please do.
Well, just I suppose really to provide the context, the Edinburgh Agreement, as everybody knows, confirmed that the referendum should be legislated for here in the Scottish Parliament. So this bill contains the government's proposals for the running and regulating of the referendum, and it's intended to do so in a way that will command confidence of Parliament, both sides of the campaign, and the wider Scottish public. I think it's important to stress that the contents of the bill have been informed by a successful consultation which attracted a very large number of responses, and also by independent expert advice. So the bill sets out the date of the referendum, the wording of the question, the rules and the spending limits for campaign funding, and the detailed rules for the conduct of the referendum. As the committee is aware, as is accepted practice, the government proposed a form of words for the question, which the Electoral Commission then tested and reported back on, and we've accepted the recommended changes of the Electoral Commission. Similarly, with spending limits, we've accepted the recommendations that the Electoral Commission made there, and these are reflected in the bill. In terms of the conduct of the referendum, the bill mirrors as far as possible the standard arrangements that are in place at elections and referendums in Scotland and in the UK. And the thinking behind that is that we want to make this referendum run in a way that is as familiar to people as possible. We've worked very closely with the Electoral Management Board, with the Electoral Commission, with EROs and others to ensure that the arrangements are fit for purpose, to incorporate lessons from recent polls, and to make sure that we are thinking through all the practicalities. I know that you've heard evidence from the Electoral Management Board and the Commission, who both stated in broad terms that they thought the legislation was fit for purpose. The Commission, I know, has suggested some possible amendments to the bill in some areas, for example, in the provision of guidance to counting officers and the deadline for proxy votes. We're continuing discussions with the Commission and with other electoral professionals on the small number of remaining technical issues like that. The Commission has also suggested that all permitted participants should have access to the polling list, which would include details of people on the young voters register. But the committee will be aware from our previous discussions that we're trying to strike a balance between putting young voters on an equal footing with other voters, but also safeguarding their details. And I know the committee was generally supportive of this in Stage 1 of the franchise bill. One other item just to mention, which may come up in discussion, the Commission has also raised concerns about campaigners' access to registers for the purpose of checking donations. I should say that all campaigners will have access to the information they need to comply with donation controls. They're entitled to a copy of the local government registers for Scotland. People on the young voters register are not permitted to donate more than £500, so the issue doesn't arise there. We can't legislate, though, for sharing other registers that are operating in Scotland, nor for any registers that operate in the rest of the UK. But if a donor is not on the local government register, there are other ways in which their eligibility to be a donor can be checked. So I think, just in conclusion, you've received a wide range of evidence. I think most of it broadly supportive of the bill. There are a number of issues that have been raised that we will look to possibly bring forward amendments at Stage 2. There's some ongoing discussion around a number of mainly technical points, and we may touch on them this morning. But for the purposes of Stage 1, I hope the committee will be able to agree that the bill provides a sound basis for delivering a referendum that is fair, transparent, and does command that confidence that I spoke about.
Thank you, Deputy First Minister. One of the issues which is, I know a number of my colleagues want to raise questions about, is the purdah period. So I'll just ask Linda Fabiani to kick off on that subject, and we'll take a number of supplementaries on it.
Yeah, quite happy to do that. We heard evidence from the Law Society and also from academics, particularly around the Purdah issue that's legislated upon here in this bill for the Scottish Government. There was some concern expressed that there was no similar legislation which would cover the UK Government. There was a view given that it would be fairly easy for that to be implemented, but I really just wanted your opinion, Deputy First Minister, about the relationship between Westminster and Holyrood through the Edinburgh Agreement, etc., about your confidence that the Purdah period that applies here would be matched by the UK Government.
Obviously, this was something that was discussed in the context of the negotiation leading up to the Edinburgh Agreement. I mean, I should say in the committee will be aware of this. We couldn't legislate here to subject the UK Government to the Purdah period that applies to the Scottish Government and public authorities in this bill. But we think it's right that that does apply to the Scottish Government, which is why it's included in the bill. The UK Government agreed to put the provision that now appears in the Edinburgh Agreement in there to make clear their intention voluntarily to submit to the same rules. I have no reason to question their good faith in that, and I would fully expect them to honour that and to honour that in full, and I've no reason to expect that they won't. It may be something that, it's not for me to say what the committee would want to comment on, obviously, but you know, it may be something the committee would want to ask them about in terms of how they will ensure that that is complied with. But you know, be in no doubt, I would be very concerned if it turned out that what is in the Edinburgh Agreement was not complied with, but I've got no reason to expect that would be the case. I think it's appropriate, it's in line with existing electoral law that you have that period, 28-day period. I don't think it should be any longer than that because, you know, clearly you have to strike a balance between fairness in the referendum period, but allowing the government of the day to get on with the business of being the government. So I think we strike the right balance here for the Scottish Government, and I would certainly hope and expect that the UK Government would honour the commitments they've given in the Edinburgh Agreement.
And below that level, we had a discussion here a couple of weeks ago, and I should probably say at this point, Convener, as a member of the corporate body, I was party to the rules that apply to parliamentarians here in Holyrood about the limits of what can be sent out using parliamentary resources and timescales running up to elections or running up to a referendum. Sorry, Tavish? And so I wonder if there's been any discussion at all at ministerial level about how the parliaments deal with this issue, because both the Yes campaign and the No campaign, I understand, although I wasn't present, said quite clearly that they felt there should be a level playing field in that regard.
But the first point, I mean, I absolutely appreciate the intention behind the question and I suppose the concern that lies behind the question. It's not fundamentally a matter for ministers and for the Scottish Government, it's for parliamentary authorities, both here in the Scottish Parliament and in the House of Commons and the Westminster Parliament, to decide what the appropriate rules should be for conduct of elected members during that period. And I know from experience that it's dangerous for a minister here to try to speak on behalf of the parliamentary authorities or the corporate body. But I absolutely agree with Linda Fabiani that there should be a level playing field, and I would hope that the parliamentary authorities in both parliaments would take reasonable and appropriate steps to make sure that that is the case. I mean, I suppose a general point I would make, which would apply to my previous answer as well as to this one, is that, you know, I think there will be public scrutiny of how politicians conduct themselves during the referendum, and I think any politician on either side, so let me make it clear I'm not casting aspersions on anybody, on either side that was seen to be abusing in any way a public office or taxpayers' money, I think the public would take a very dim view of that. So I hope there would almost be a self-regulating pressure on politicians, but equally I think parliaments, and I'm pretty sure the Scottish Parliament and I would hope the UK Parliament as well, would ensure that MPs, MSPs, folk who are in Parliament would operate appropriately during the period.
Thank you.
Patrick, I think you had questions in this area as well.
Thank you. The legislation does mention the Scottish Parliament corporate body. Does the government have a view legally as to what the impact of that provision would be, as it's currently drafted, on the conduct of parliamentary business, particularly if the Parliament decided to conduct its summer recess on the usual timescale, covering July and August, which would imply 2 or 3 weeks of parliamentary business after recess during Purda. What impact would that have if we passed the legislation as it stands and had a normally timed recess?
Well, firstly, as Patrick Harvey is indicating, I think it's section 25 of the bill specifically includes the corporate body as a body to which these, to use the terminology, Purda restrictions applied. So that would mean that the corporate body was not able to publish anything covered by the restrictions in subsection 1 of section 25. Now, taken at its widest interpretation, the description of relevant material could include, preclude is the more correct way of saying it, the publication of an enormous degree of material relating to the business of governing Scotland. And that's why, as I said in response to Linda, we think the 28-day period is the right balance. Having it any longer would risk getting in the way of the business of normal government. Again, I'm going to kind of constrain my remarks here to some degree, because it is absolutely a matter for Parliament to decide the dates of recess. But I do think, and I'll be frank, I think Parliament sitting during the Purda period would undoubtedly mean that we would be sitting with enormous constraints on what the Parliament and the government could do, and I'm sure that's something the parliamentary authorities will take due account of.
I think there are discussions taking place about what to do about summer recess, but just obviously I'm not asking you as Deputy First Minister to say what Parliament should do about its recess. I'm asking what impact the legislation you're proposing would have if Parliament was to make various decisions. Now, one option is to have the normal recess, and that would impact on Parliament's ability to conduct its business during early September. It would also, it seems to me, leave ministers open to the accusation, because a lot of this is about perception, that even answering questions and making statements in the chamber on the issues of the referendum would breach Purda. If, though, we moved recess forward so that it began later and ended later, surely there's a prospect that other political parties, opposition parties, whether they're pro or anti-independence, should also be concerned about that we don't have the opportunity to hold ministers to account in the chamber for statements that they've made during recess before Purda begins.
I sort of agree with both of those statements, to be honest, and again, without wanting to intrude onto ground that is properly for the Parliament and not for the government, and I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I think it's important that I keep that distinction. I think there is undoubtedly a way to find a solution to the recess arrangements next year that take account of both of those concerns. I do think, given the way the Purda provisions are drafted, and remember these are in line with how this would operate under normal electoral law. We've not drafted something differently here. If Parliament was sitting during the Purda period, I think if you think about the kind of normal First Minister's question session, for example, I think it is very difficult to imagine how that could proceed in a way that was consistent with the Purda period. But that's for Parliament to decide and Parliament to come to a reasonable solution on, and I'm sure that solution is there to be found.
Finally, on this issue, if the committee was to consider any changes to the section on publications, the section on Purda in the bill, either in light of decisions that Parliament might make about recess or any other issues, is it your understanding, following negotiations with the UK Government, that the UK Government will adopt whatever Purda arrangements the Scottish legislation imposes on the Scottish Government, or will that need to be renegotiated? Any changes to the nature of it?
I think we're inevitably getting into kind of speculative territory here. The agreement in the Edinburgh Agreement is that we would apply the PEPERA Purda, and the UK Government through the Edinburgh Agreement would agree to sign up to that. I think if we were to have something significantly different to that, then obviously we would need to discuss with colleagues in the UK Government what that meant for the interpretation of the Edinburgh Agreement. But we'll look as government carefully at any amendments that did come forward, and when we get to stage 2 and stage 3 of the bill, I'd be more able to give you my view once I see the detail of amendments of what I thought that meant for the Edinburgh Agreement.
Thank you.
Honourable Goldie, I think you wanted to raise questions in this area as well.
Thanks, Convener. Deputy First Minister, in terms of the Section 25 of Part 4 of the bill, this whole Purdah regime, I mean, is a broadcast ministerial opinion published material under that section?
Sorry, repeat that?
Well, if a minister is giving an interview and happens to say something which quite inadvertently portrays independence in a glowing and rosy light, is that published material in terms of this bill?
Published material doesn't just refer to written publications. I think it has a broader application than that. So, clearly there would be the possibility that that would be the case if, the person was speaking as a government minister in the course of government business. I'm just saying.
A period.
Yeah. Publish means make available. I'm reading from the bill here. Publish means make available to the public at large or any section of the public in whatever form and by whatever means in the relevant period, which is 28 days. That applies to things ministers would do or say as ministers. During an election campaign, when we're in Purdah, ministers as politicians, will be free to campaign for a particular party. It involves things that we would be doing in our capacity as government ministers.
I mean, as I read the section, Convener, the publication part is linked to the material bit. And I can understand an embargo that stops the Scottish Government sending out, documentation or material. Everyone understands that. But what I'm not quite clear about is if a Scottish Government minister in an interview, I mean, you haven't got material per se, but you've got the minister giving a view being broadcast to the nation at large.
Yeah, I think in many interviews you were doing in the 28-day period, you would be doing them as politicians, as members of one campaign or another, not as a government minister. If, for example, during the 28-day period, a minister with the full support of the civil service was to go and do a ministerial visit somewhere to announce something, then there may be no written publication, but if it was something that could be seen to have an impact on the referendum or be associated with the issues in the referendum, then that would fall foul of the Purdah period. Me as deputy leader of the SNP during the 28-day period on, question time or something is not falling foul of Purdah because I'm not doing that as a government minister. I'm not doing it using the resources of government. I mean, I think it's important to stress this is not, it's different in the sense we're not dealing with an election, we're dealing with a referendum, but these are the same rules that apply during elections. So, as a minister in the 2011 election for that period of Purdah, I was restricted in what I could do as a government minister. I was not restricted in my ability to go around the country campaigning for the return of an SNP government, but I couldn't use the resources of the civil service to do that. Not that they would have ever countenanced that, but that would have fallen foul of Purdah. So, I think while we're dealing with this and talking about this in the context of a referendum, we've all got, and previous governments will have experience of operating within these rules in previous elections. It's not a new concept.
Separate issue, and this, thank you, Deputy First Minister. This is perhaps more for Mr. Fisher. If after the referendum, somebody who's got the deep pockets to fund a judicial review considers there's been a breach of the Purdah protocol and that could have influenced the outcome of the election, I mean, is judicial review a competent avenue available to people if they think there's been a breach?
Certainly in relation to a breach of this provision, yes, judicial review is potentially available as a sanction, and I know some questions have been raised around the sanctions.
And what is the judicial review application? Is it that the Purdah protocol was breached and that's terrible and everyone's been very naughty, or is the Purdah protocol has been breached, that is appalling, and the referendum result should be set aside? What is the remedy?
I think that would depend on what remedies were sought at the time of bringing the judicial review, but I think there's been some evidence that you've heard from some parties, including Professor Mullen, that along the lines that a court might be reluctant to set aside the overall result of the referendum, but that would depend on the challenge. Obviously, there are particular restrictions about some legal challenges in relation to the number of votes counted, etc. On the way judicial review would apply there. But broadly, that's the position.
I think we are. If there's a breach of this, is there any meaningful sanction? And I guess the only meaningful sanction is after the outcome, public attitude.
I mean, I don't want to kind of appear glib here, but and nor do I want to predict how the sort of behaviour during the campaign. But I'm pretty sure that if a minister of either government was to breach these PURDA rules in the 28-day period, then those who were on the other side of the campaign would be jumping up and down about it, to the extent that the media and the publicity around that would have. I'm not saying it's the only restriction, that's why it's in law, because we want to make sure there is an appropriate restriction, but the public price of doing that, I think, operates as a constraint as well. And I would stress that we're not talking about a new concept here. We're talking about rules that apply to every government in every election. So the government, the civil service, are well used to dealing with a PURDA period.
Okay, thank you.
Linda, I think you've got a supplementary, and could others indicate if they've got a supplementary? Stuart, you've got a supplementary in this area as well. Okay.
Yeah, it was very much on that point. Thank you, convener. It struck me back to the questions I was asking earlier. And the regulation of the PURDA period. First of all, who is deemed to be regulating this PURDA period as it goes on, other than the self-regulation that the Deputy First Minister you've mentioned. But talking about sanctions, talking about the potential of judicial review, that would only apply to the Scottish Government, because that's where the legislation lies. So it's back again to the potential of quick, and Professor Mullen said it would be quick, as did the Law Society, potential quick legislation that puts the UK Government on the same footing as the Scottish Government in these terms.
I mean, if that's something the committee felt that it wanted to recommend, then I'm sure the UK Government would respond to you on that. Obviously, I'm not here to speak for the UK Government, but I see the point you're making, which is why we were very anxious and achieved in the Edinburgh Agreement the commitment that is in there. As I said earlier on, I've got no reason to believe bad faith, but clearly the committee is it's open to the committee to recommend that there should be something stronger, but it's not in the gift of the Scottish Government to legislate in a way that covers the UK Government.
Millen.
Thank you, convener. Good morning. I think just to remind colleagues, certainly a couple of weeks ago when Blair McDougall was in front of the committee, this particular issue was raised, and Blair McDougall from the No campaign was saying that he stressed the point on more than one occasion about the court of public opinion, particularly in the issue of PURDA. So I think just to remind colleagues of that. That's it. But the question I've got actually just is regarding a letter that we received from Chloe Smith MP, the Minister for Political and Constitutional Reform. One of the paragraphs in the letter I just thought was extremely interesting. This was regarding the agreement that took place last year. And she goes on to say in the letter that in this bill, the Scottish Government are able to include a power to make modifications to electoral law for the purposes of the referendum, to replicate or make separate provisions if they consider it necessary. Now, with that being the case, that a UK Government Minister has suggested that, do you think, Cabinet Secretary, that in terms of the legislation and the referendum that's going to take place, do you think actually it may well be worthwhile particularly regarding the PURDA period, I think actually it would be worthwhile for this particular piece of legislation to be amended so that it actually does incorporate Westminster MPs in order for them to comply with the PURDA period in Scotland.
Yeah, I think I don't have the Chloe Smith letter in front of me, but I have seen a copy of it. I think what she was referring to was our ability within our own competence to amend the bill to deal with the issue about the children of service personnel. I am what I'm saying to you is we do not have the power, either under the Edinburgh Agreement or elsewhere, to legislate to subject a UK government to a purdah period for the purposes of the referendum. So it wouldn't be possible to do that in this bill.
Okay. Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to come to Patricia. I think this will be the last question on issues to do with purdah, and then I'll come to Tavish.
I just wondered if the Deputy First Minister could give us some clarification, because the beginning of the section that talks about purdah and about publications says restrictions on publication, etc., of promotional material by central and local government, etc. It then does go on, of course, to mention Scottish Ministers, SPCB and other public authorities. But I just wondered whether the Deputy First Minister wants to clarify what promotional material would be considered to be in that context.
Oh, I mean, promotional material would be, for example, the government sending out a brochure telling people that if Scotland voted one way or the other, then it would make education or health or whatever better in Scotland. So, the definitions are in the section, although, it talks about publish rather than the definition of promotional material. So, I think it's fairly clear. The government couldn't do anything as government during that purdah period that was trying to influence the result of the referendum in any way. And, as I say, these are rules that apply during elections. They are not new rules.
I'm very well aware of that, and I have also fought 2 elections under those rules as a government minister. But I would just say that the business of government does, of course, go on during a purdah period. So there is a difference between the kind of thing that you can't do under purdah as a minister and the kind of thing that you do continue to do. And I wonder whether the use of the word promotional in that context was actually deliberate by the drafters to make that differentiation.
It's the standard. It's not, it's not, as I understand it, a different drafting for the purposes of this bill. In terms of what would constitute promotional material, the headings in paragraph 25(1) give the view of what that would be. Information that was providing general information about the referendum, deal with any of the issues raised in the referendum, put any arguments for or against, or is designed to encourage voting. So, I think what makes this, these are, as you know as well as I do, these are normal rules. I think where the distinction lies is that given the nature of the referendum and the nature of the issue at the heart of the referendum, I think it would be restrictive of much of what government would do in terms of the day-to-day business of government.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Tavish Scott, moving on to regulatory period issues, I think.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just on that last point, which I accept from the Deputy First Minister, presumably she would accept that while these may be normal rules and we may have some doubts about the adequacy of those rules, the basic principle is that this referendum is not just like a general election. This is a cataclysmic event in the future of all our lives.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, was that you asking me a question?
Yes.
I think it's the biggest opportunity Scotland's had in 300 years, yes.
It's rather different from just a normal general election.
Of course it's different from a general election.
Thank you. That's all I was asking. Thank you. Can I now move on to the Nigel Smith's evidence, in which he says both governments should issue... in which he says leaving the bill as it stands means both governments will be regulated for the first 3 months of the referendum, not by this bill, but by ministerial codes and public outcry. Would you agree with that evidence?
Could you expand a bit, because I'm not entirely sure.
I'll read the quote again. Leaving the bill as it stands means both governments will be regulated, by which he means in the regulated period, will be regulated for the first 3 months of the referendum, not by this bill, but by ministerial codes and public outcry.
No, governments are regulated during the purdah period.
That's not the purdah period. I'm terribly sorry, Deputy Presiding Officer. He's describing the regulated period, the full regulated period from May onwards.
Well, the regulated period refers to designated organisations for the campaign for permitted participants. It relates to the rules around donations and campaign expenses. It doesn't specifically regulate government. Governments are regulated under the section we've just been spoken about, which is what is colloquially known as the purdah period.
Indeed, I completely accept that. So Nigel Smith's evidence is right then. The quote I've read you is perfectly correct then.
I'm sorry, Mr Scott, I'm not quite sure I'm following what point you're making here.
Well, I'm not making any point. I'm simply reading the evidence that's been provided to this committee by Nigel Smith, in which he says, and I repeat, leaving the bill as it stands means both governments, by which he means obviously yours and the UK government, will be regulated for the first 3 months of the referendum, not by this bill, but by ministerial codes and public outcry.
The restriction on government is for the 28-day purdah period, which is in line with normal practice.
Okay, Mr Smith also says in his evidence to this committee that despite ministerial codes of conduct, the government can easily plan its business, lean on public bodies and taxpayer-funded clients, and use the profile of office with its routine attendance of media to its own advantage in the first 3 months of any referendum it calls. Would you accept that?
Well, I mean, I can only speak for the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government would not behave in that way. I can't speak for the UK Government, but I hope they would not behave in that way either.
So when in Schedule 4, Part 4, 25.3c of the bill, where it names, could you maybe just clarify what it means by public bodies? Any Scottish public authority with mixed functions or no reserved functions within the meaning of the Scotland Act 1998. Is that the kind of body that would be covered under this description? I can make available to the committee a list of the public bodies that would be, I mean, I'm not going to read it out because it goes over 4 pages, but I can, the issue is we couldn't cover public bodies that had wholly reserved functions. So the legislation talks about public bodies that have devolved or mixed functions, but as I say, I can make available to the committee the list of Scottish public authorities with mixed functions or no reserved functions, but as I say, as it goes over at least 2 pages, I probably shouldn't read it into the record. I'll accept that, thank you for that, but would you be able to clarify the role that agencies of government and all the public agencies that the Scottish Government does fund will have during the regulated period of next year?
But if they are a Scottish public authority with mixed functions or no reserved functions, then they will be subject to the same rules that apply to the government and to the Parliament corporate body as we've been talking about.
And what would those rules be from the full regulated period? Not the purdah period, the full regulated period?
The restrictions on publication of information or promotional activity that we've been talking about apply in the 28-day period. They don't apply in the 16-week regulated period. Again, I would stress that is normal electoral practice.
Well, I'm very grateful for that very clear answer. So there's no restriction on their activities in the full regulated period.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what Tavish Scott is trying to say here. I don't know whether he's suggesting that, for example, the Scottish Legal Aid Board or the Scottish Information Commission or the Scottish Police Services Authority or the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman in some way are going to behave inappropriately during the regulated period that require them to be covered in some way that is different to what would happen in normal electoral practice. I mean, if that is what he's alleging, perhaps he should be explicit about it.
Perhaps you should stop putting words in my mouth. I just asked you a question. That's all I was doing.
And I'm answering the question. The purdah period is 28-day purdah period. The regulated period applies to the campaign designated organisations, to permitted participants, and it covers things like donations and expenses. I think we're all, as politicians, perfectly well versed in what that covers. The purdah period looks to put additional restrictions on government and public authorities, and that is a 28-day period, regulated period, which is normal electoral practice.
So the government's view is that in the regulated period, not the purdah period, I completely accept the evidence the Deputy First Minister has given in relation to the purdah period, but in the regulated period, the normal operations of government will continue, and that covers all those public agencies, and at the moment that is just seen as what will happen during that period in every possible context.
Yes, but public authorities behave at all times in line with, appropriate behaviour, and that, of course, is, as I said in response, I think, to Linda Fabiani, you couldn't, or in my view, you shouldn't have a purdah period that extends too long, because then you do interfere over an extended period of time with the normal running of government. But that doesn't mean that outside of that 28-day period, public authorities don't have restrictions on how they behave. They are public authorities. The Scottish Government has at any time restrictions on how they behave. As a minister, at any time, on any day of the week, in any week of the year, I cannot, as a minister, using the resources of the civil service, do certain things which are purely, which are party political. So, you know, those restrictions apply to government, they apply. Public authorities don't operate in a political way, and they will not do that during the regulated period any more than they will do that now. And, you know, I hope nobody would question the integrity of some of the organisations that are on this list.
So you don't accept, I would therefore presume from all that, the suggestion that has been made by Nigel Smith in his evidence to this committee, where he said both governments, and again I stress the word both, should issue white papers and statements, then cease to take part in the referendum as governments, exactly as was done in the 1975 EC referendum.
I hesitate to comment on what happened in the 1975 EC referendum, since I was, I don't think I was even at primary school, but no, I don't agree with that. I think governments operate within you know, constraints already. There are things that it's appropriate for governments to do, and there are things that it is not appropriate for government to do at any time. And I think those rules should apply as normal. But the idea that you know, next month or you know, next January, the UK government, let alone the Scottish government, wouldn't be able to participate within those due constraints in the referendum debate, you know, I think is taking it too far.
Perfectly accept your opinion. It's perfectly fair to lay that on the record. Can I just ask you, in the context of that last answer, what are those rules and sanctions that might apply to a public body that overstepped the mark during the regulated period next summer? What are the rules that a citizen of Scotland might adopt?
I mean, in terms of law, I mean, judicial review, but can I just, I'm not going to read out the whole list, but can I just read out some of the organisations?
But I just asked for the rules, I didn't ask for the list.
Well, no, but I think it is important. I'll come on to your question, but I think it is important for those who might be reading the official report of this to know what some of the organisations we're talking about actually are. The Additional Support Needs Tribunals for Scotland, the Judicial Appointments Board for Scotland, the Mental Health Tribunal for Scotland, the Mental Welfare Commission, the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator, the Parole Board for Scotland. These are the kind of organisations we're talking about here. Now, you know, I'm the first person to say that it is absolutely essential that the rules for this referendum are beyond reproach. But, you know, nobody's seriously suggesting that these kind of organisations are going to somehow be out there campaigning for either side in this referendum. I just think that stretches credibility, frankly. In terms of the sanctions for public authorities that breach the rules of behaviour, you would be talking judicial review mainly would be the sanction, as well as, I'm pretty sure, public outrage if the type of organisation that is on this list were to participate in any way in one side or other of the referendum, just as there would be public outrage if these kinds of organisations were to become involved in an election campaign.
Thank you.
Quick supplementaries from Stuart Maxwell and
briefly,
from
given we've been taken to the realms of fantasy, I'll just carry on in that vein. Is it the case, Deputy First Minister, that the Scottish Government has negotiated with the UK Government that the same rules would apply not only for the regulated period but also for the purdah period? You did talk about the purdah period earlier in the Edinburgh Agreement, but I presume that all public bodies that carry out reserved functions would be under exactly the same rules during the regulated period as would public bodies that carry out functions which are devolved.
Yep. There are no specific restrictions, restrictions
same
beyond the normal, you know, restrictions that apply to public bodies that apply during the regulated period. In terms of the purdah period, you know, just I think it was paragraph 29 of the Edinburgh Agreement, Scottish Government will set out details of restricted behaviour for ministers and devolved public bodies in the bill to be introduced to the Scottish Parliament. These details will be based on the restrictions set out in PAPERA. The UK Government has committed to act according to the same PAPERA-based rules. So that's the wording.
So in other words, during the regulated period, whether a body is, public body is dealing with reserved, mixed or devolved issues, it would be exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
Thank you.
Very well.
Yes, no, thank you, Convener. It's just a follow-on from the line of interrogation which Tavish Scott was pursuing, Deputy First Minister, in relation to the public bodies and the not just the purdah period, but the referendum period itself. I think I'm aware that this election is different from a normal Scottish parliamentary or general election, in that the field of choice is narrow. People are going to be asked to make one of two choices. And I think I'm more concerned about somebody inadvertently who's involved with a public body being drawn into a comment or a statement, because, as I say, I think anybody who holds party political views is, to be fair, usually pretty scrupulous in how they conduct themselves if they happen to be members of these public organisations. But would it be proposed by the Scottish Government just to say to these public organisations, for which the Deputy First Minister has an obviously exceedingly long list, to simply write a general letter of guidance pointing out what would be inappropriate during this sensitive period?
I mean, the government will provide guidance of, what that we are suggesting that public bodies would comply with during. So, once this bill is through, we would propose to do guidance, which I think would happen during any Purda period. And, the committee will have the opportunity, if it so desires, to scrutinise and make suggestions about that guidance. I'm happy to provide a draft of it to the committee at the appropriate time.
Thanks, Convener.
I think it would be helpful when that's ready to be sent to these various bodies, obviously sometime down the road, if the committee could see a copy of that, and that might make people feel a bit more assured about what's actually going on. With that, though, can I move to James now, who wants to raise issues about permitted participants?
Okay, thank you, Convener. Deputy First Minister, you'll be aware that in the evidence sessions we had some discussion around the area of permitted participants, and there were some concerns raised that potentially the role of permitted participants could be used, to channel surplus funds from campaign organisations in order to, top up the limits in effect. Are you confident that the provisions in the bill and the associated regulations are competent enough to close any loopholes in relation to people trying to abuse the use of the permitted participant?
Obviously, I mean, for the Electoral Commission to govern the whole permitted participant arrangements, we accepted the Electoral Commission's recommendations on the spending limit for permitted participants that are not one of the designated organisations. As you will appreciate, our original view had been the spending limit for permitted participants should have been much lower than that, and that may or may not have reduced or obviated the concern you're talking about, but we took the view that it was right to follow the Electoral Commission's recommendations. I mean, obviously, as I say, it's for the Electoral Commission to govern this. There is a process that individuals or organisations have to go through in terms of declaring that they are a permitted participant. There is a published list of which the Electoral Commission have to publish of organisations or individuals who have the designation of permitted participants. So there is a degree of public scrutiny around that. So I think what I'm saying is I'm satisfied that the legislation goes as far as legislation can go in terms of making sure that that is a system that is above board. On the other side of that debate, I suppose, we do want people to participate in the referendum. Now, I should say, the vast majority of people will participate without ever registering as a permitted participant. But, the whole concept of permitted participant is to allow people that are not a political party or a designated organisation to participate and to spend money in support of their participation. I'm not here, obviously, to speak for any campaign or political party, but whether in reality we will have the situation of campaigns or parties having surplus funds, I'm, I suppose, a bit more sceptical about.
We heard evidence from Yes Scotland to the effect that they had quite a kind of loose arrangement in terms that they would work with organisations like Women for Independence, Business for Independence, but they wouldn't be formally part of the Yes Scotland group, and they would come under the permitted participants umbrella. Would you have a concern that that would potentially undermine the level playing field that you were talking about earlier? Absolutely
not, because you described that as a loose arrangement. I would describe it as an arrangement that's entirely in line with the legislative framework. And I mean, I saw the evidence from Yes and from the No campaign. I think, I'm sorry if I'm misquoting at all here, I don't have the evidence in front of me, that the No campaign said that they would, they wouldn't have separate groups. Everybody would be part of the designated campaign. I don't know whether that would ever actually be the case, to be honest. I'm not sure, presumably if UKIP want to campaign in the election, in the referendum, then I don't know, will they be part of the No Campaigns official organisation, or will they be separate? So, you know, the rules allow permitted participants. They set down rules of how that should work. If any group on either side wants to spend more than the required amount, they have to register as permitted participants.
Are you considering any amendments in this area? You know, one of the things that came up in evidence was that the trigger for a permitted participant is £10,000. Would you consider reducing that? Do you think it's appropriate that there should be more guidance about the role of permitted participants?
Oh, I'm not considering at the moment amendments here, and I'll explain why. I should, you know, sort of caveat that comment by saying that I will consider any suggestions that particularly this committee put forward for amendments. So if the committee was to suggest amendments in this area, of course I would give them due consideration. But these, the provisions in the bill around this are in line with the Electoral Commission recommendations. And in terms of guidance around permitted participants, that would be for the Electoral Commission, not for the government. Now, as I said earlier on, it's no secret that the Scottish Government originally wanted spending limits for permitted participants that were much lower than are in this bill, but many people, I think including sort of other parties, said that the government must comply with Electoral Commission recommendations. That's what we've done, and that's what's reflected in the bill, and I'm not planning amendments to that at this stage, but as I say, I will always consider suggestions that are put forward.
Bearing in mind some of the controversy around this area, can you give some assurance that there's not a conflict of interest between your role as a Cabinet Secretary taking the legislation through the Parliament and your role as a member of the Yes Scotland Advisory Board?
Yes, I can give an absolute assurance around that.
Patrick?
Yes, sorry, Convener. I just wanted to say for the record that I think in relation to James Kelly's previous question, the evidence that we heard from the Yes Scotland campaign 2 weeks ago suggested that the other groups they work with may or may not choose to register as permitted participants, but it wasn't for the Yes Scotland organisation to make that determination, and that they anticipated some of those organisations may not be spending money during the regulated period at the level that would require them to register. I just wanted to put that on the record.
Move on to another area. In that case, Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Deputy First Minister. How can we be sure that voters will get the information that they need to make an informed decision in the referendum? You know, what influences do you think the Electoral Commission should have in this, and also the campaigns of yes and no?
I think there's a very clear distinction between the two is the first point I should make. The Electoral Commission has responsibility to provide information that will, you know, advise people how to vote and how to register to vote. It will not in any way, shape or form, nor should it, stray into information that puts the case for one or other side of the referendum debate, or even put forward information on both sides. It's not the Electoral Commission's role to get into the issues and the arguments behind the debate. That is very much for the two campaigns, and I'm pretty sure that both campaigns will be working very hard to make sure that they are providing the electorate with the information they need to make their decision.
Well, there are two parts to this question, because you know, we've been informed by the Electoral Commission that they have a developed plan and that they're going to come back to us. Do you think that people should have that in their hands at an early stage, the information which the Electoral Commission is working up about the process?
I mean, the Electoral Commission, I think, well, have said, I think they said it in evidence to the committee, that they will have a public awareness campaign. You know, I think it would be wrong for me to start to say too much about what I thought the Electoral Commission couldn't or should or shouldn't do, since they have an independent role in terms of raising awareness. But I would fully expect that they would, you know, take appropriate steps at as early a stage as is appropriate in the referendum to raise that awareness. And I'm sure they will. Again, I don't speak for them here, but I'm sure they'd be very happy to have further engagement with the committee as those plans
Second part
progress.
of the question is really, Convener, about evidence that we had from Blair McDougall in response to a letter which suggested that in a previous referendum the yes and the no case had been put side by side on neutral material with their cases there. The neutral material from the Electoral Commission or its equivalent in the past. But the other process, of course, is the use of free post now. Do you think that these are mutually exclusive?
In terms of, I'm not sure exactly what you meant in terms of the first part, or rather what you were quoting Blair McDougall, that the Electoral Commission should put the yes and no campaign side by side, because they won't do that.
No, indeed, but there could be material provided by the yes and no campaigns distributed in the Electoral Commission material. Do you think that's a possibility?
I mean, I think that would be something that the Electoral Commission would have to discuss directly with the yes and the no campaign. In terms of your second point about mail shots, so obviously the legislation provides for a free mail shot for both of the designated campaigns that can go either to every household or to every elector. Sure. And you know, it's obviously for the campaigns within the normal rules of propriety around election addresses as to what they put in these publications. I think in terms of your first question, you know, if the yes and the no campaign were of that view, then it would be a discussion that they would have to have with the Electoral Commission.
Sure. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. I think that takes us to Patricia on access issues.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Really just for clarification as much as anything else, some of the organisations with whom we discussed the bill in a round table setting had raised issues around people who perhaps are partially sighted or blind, or who had problems of literacy. And we noted that the bill does talk about people with blindness or other physical disability or inability to read. I wondered if in the first instance of blindness and physical disability, whether Deputy First Minister would think that that covers people who are also or who might be partially sighted.
Yes, I think it can do. I mean, without reading from the appropriate section in the bill, you know, the bill already provides for, you know, a large sample of the ballot paper to be made available, or for people in certain circumstances to have assistance to vote. I know there have been comments made around this. I think it's one area where I would be very open to amendments at stage 2 if there were, you know, sort of additional things that we could put in the bill to make it very clear that if people, because of a disability of any description, needed special arrangements in terms of voting, that would be appropriate. So I'm very open to any suggestions that either the committee or organisations want to make.
I think the point they were making in that regard is that at the moment, as things stand in the bill, the presiding officer has to require the voter to declare. Now, I suspect most presiding officers would just take that you know, as someone's view, but there might be occasions when someone asks to see the person's certificate that indicates that they are blind, whereas people who are partially sighted might not have the same opportunity to be able to provide something that gives that proof. So I think that area would be interesting to pursue, perhaps, as you say, at stage 2. But the other area is, of course, people with literacy problems, and the suggestion was made that the easy read, an easy read formulation could be come at without too much difficulty, that would allow people who have literacy problems to take part without having to declare that they do have that problem, which I think would be a benefit if it could be managed. And I just wondered if you had a view on that.
I don't have a fixed view on that. I mean, that particular point I've not considered in detail. I'm happy to do so. And in terms of your first point, you know, as you rightly say, presiding officers have the discretion in terms of, you know, whether to accept that somebody needs those special arrangements. I'm more than happy that we, you know, have a discussion at that level to get a better assessment of whether we think the existing arrangements which are replicated in this bill are sufficient, or whether we need to have any more definition around that. So I would say genuinely I am open-minded about the blind partially sighted issue that you raised, but also whether people with literacy issues or, you know, other or disabilities other than blindness might need some special arrangements. So I'll undertake to have some discussions at government level, and based on the discussions the committee has had, if there are any particular suggestions that you want to put forward, I will give an undertaking to give them consideration.
That'd be very helpful, thank you.
Annabel Ewing, I think you wanted to raise issues to do with
yes, thank you, Convener. Just briefly, and good morning, Deputy First Minister. Just really dealing with correspondence the committee's received, both from the Deputy First Minister and from the UK Cabinet Office, on the issue of 16 and 17-year-old children of soldiers who are on the register by virtue of the service declaration. And I mean, I've read through the correspondence, and I note the lack of data at the moment, because the MOD doesn't collect that data. And I note that discussions that have taken place thus far, and I also note that it is anticipated that the actual numbers involved here might be, I think, taking from the letter from the Deputy First Minister, the likely range is there for 0 to low hundreds of individuals, with the number likely to be towards the lower end of this range. But nonetheless, could I ask the Deputy First Minister to undertake to pursue further discussions with the relevant bodies, in particular, I would imagine, the registration officers and officials, to examine the issue in more depth to see what could be done, taking into account practical reality and practical constraints. And it would be helpful if the Deputy First Minister could make that undertaking today to the committee, and also to report back perhaps in early September as to where those discussions may have.
I'm happy to give that undertaking. In fact, we've already started those discussions. I mean, as the note I sent to the committee makes clear, we believe that the numbers are very low. We can't be definite because of the lack of data, but we think they are going to be very low. On the other hand, there is an issue of principle, and I accept that there is that issue of principle, which is why we've undertaken to see if there is a legislative solution to this, which we can do through this bill, and which gives us more time than trying to do it through the franchise bill.
Okay, thank you, Convener. That answers that.
That takes us, I think, to Stuart Maxwell on issues to do with turnout.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Hopefully a fairly straightforward question. Obviously, we've had some evidence, Deputy First Minister, about the issues surrounding turnout and how individual areas will cope with a particularly enlarged turnout. Obviously, the expectation of many people is that turnout will be greater than it has been for normal elections in recent years. Could you maybe outline for us any planning that has already been undertaken to deal with potential increase in turnout?
Well, we're already talking at official level with the Electoral Management Board, with the Chief Counting Officer, to make sure that as each area of the country plans for the holding of the referendum, that they are making sure that they are sufficiently resourced to deal with turnouts that may be higher than you would see in a normal election. I think as normal practice, counting officers, returning officers would normally plan for a turnout in the region of 70 to 80%. You know, I don't know what the turnout in the referendum would be. I think it's reasonable for us to hope that we would have a turnout that is even higher than that. So it will be a key part of the discussions and the planning of those responsible for the conduct of the vote on the day, to make sure that they are adequately resourced to deal with turnouts at the higher end of expectations.
And does the same discussions and planning apply to the post the actual vote itself, in terms of the count?
Yes.
And how that would be undertaken?
Yes.
Great.
And I should say, I know it wasn't your question, but I should say planning at the moment is on the basis of overnight counts, not next day counts.
Glad to hear it.
Me too.
Patrick Harvey, I think you had an issue you wanted to raise about Section 31 and restrictions to legal challenge issues, which...
Thank you. Just very briefly, Annabel Goldie touched on this earlier when we were talking about Purdah and whether alleged breaches of Purdah might be seen as the potential basis for a legal challenge. I was wanting to ask about the time limit that's been set for legal challenges applying only to challenges about the number of votes cast, the counting of the number of votes cast. Why was it decided that a time limit should apply to those challenges on those grounds, but not to challenges on other grounds? And does an effective time limit exist elsewhere for other challenges?
I'll answer a part of your question there very briefly, and then I'll hand over to the lawyer on my left-hand side here to give a bit more detail. This mirrors, as I understand it, the provisions for the AV referendum, so we've taken standard practice there. I'll let Graham add a bit more, and then I'll maybe add again at the end.
Yeah, I mean, that excuse me, that's essentially the answer to to the question, I mean, it's a detailed restriction just in relation to the votes cast, and it only applies to challenges brought on those grounds. So it restricts the period to 6 weeks. In Scotland, there's no fixed time limit generally for judicial review, and this adds one in relation to to this aspect, just in the interests of certainty for this important aspect of running the referendums.
So if a challenge was brought on grounds of the Electoral Commission not having fulfilled its functions, or incorrect information, or the ballot paper having been misleading, or any other grounds, there'd be no time limit at all.
There's no general time limit on judicial review proceedings. It's another question as to whether or not any challenge like that would be likely to be successful, and that would of course depend on the particular cases. But if it is a challenge to the number of ballot papers counted or votes cast, then it will be caught by this rule. But otherwise, then it would just fall to the general position, and that that would depend on the merits of any challenge like that. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the committee's already heard some evidence about whether or not that was likely to be successful.
I'd be happy, again, without giving any commitments, I'd be happy that we consider whether any more definition around this would be appropriate. I mean, I think there would always be a balance you would want to strike between restrictions in the bill and not fettering the normal right of judicial review. But if the committee wants, I will happily give it more consideration. Given that we've replicated something here that applied in a previous referendum, I think it's reasonable to look to see whether it is as tightly drawn as it should be.
Thank you.
Stuart Millen.
Thank you. A couple of weeks ago, when we had representatives in from both the Yes and the No campaigns, they both indicated their desire to they'll be applying to become the designated organisations for the respective sides, and they both indicated that they would like to see this happen as soon as possible. And with that being the case, would you consider, Deputy First Minister, actually bringing forward a timetable to allow organisations to actually apply to become the designated organisations?
Yeah, I'm pretty sympathetic to this. I think, given that, well, I hope I'm not saying anything controversial here. I think we pretty much know who the designated organisations on both sides are. I'm sympathetic to the notion that why would you then have to wait until the start of the regulated period to have them formally designated as the lead organisation. So I think there's some discussion we need to have. The Electoral Commission, I know, is quite open to this as well, but I think we need to have discussion around practicalities and any unintended consequences or relationship with other pieces of legislation. But in principle, I'm sympathetic to that idea, and it's something that we might bring forward suggestions around at a later stage of the bill.
Okay, that's helpful. I've got one other question on a different matter, if that's okay.
Yeah, on you go.
Okay, thank you. It's just that, I mean, throughout the period, excuse me, throughout the period of time of this bill going through the Parliament, there have been some issues raised, certainly outside of here, regarding the issue of the costs of the referendum. Are you satisfied that the costs associated with the referendum are still going to be what the government actually have indicated, or do you anticipate that there will be an increase?
No, we are satisfied that what we've laid out in the financial memorandum encapsulates the costs of running the referendum. Obviously, when we previously had the draft referendum bill in 2010, we estimated the cost there at around £10 million. There was no breakdown given of that cost at the time. The estimates that are in the financial memorandum take account of experience of the Electoral Commission in overseeing the AV referendum, so we're able to be much more accurate about what their costs are likely to be. There's one other kind of important change which flows from our commitment to follow PEPERA as far as possible in the referendum, and that's around the mail shot. Originally we'd envisaged that both campaigns would get a free mail shot to every household, but PEPERA has the possibility of them having a free mail shot to every elector. So we've included that in the bill, which has an implication on the cost estimate. So basically, the costs of kind of running the referendum, as you'll see in the financial memorandum, are still under that under that 10 million, I think it's about 8.6 million or something. The other 4.7 that takes it up to the 13.3, if my arithmetic is correct there, deals with the Electoral Commission's costs and the free mail shot. So I'm confident in the figures we've put forward. And the Finance Committee, I know, has taken evidence, and it has said that it doesn't intend to give any further consideration to the financial memorandum.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you.
Okay. Patricia Ferguson.
Speaking of PEPERA, one of the aspects of PEPERA is to give the Electoral Commission the responsibility for accrediting and drawing up a code of practice for individuals or organisations who may be observers to an election in the UK. But the bill as it stands doesn't currently incorporate that code of practice. And I just wondered whether that's something that the government was looking to amend, because obviously I think there will be a great deal of interest internationally in the process of the referenda, and I think it would be useful if that was able to be enshrined in the normal way in the legislation.
It's certainly our intention that the Electoral Commission would have that function for the reasons that you outlined. We're already in discussions with the Electoral Commission as part of our discussions about that. I'm happy to look to see whether we need to make an amendment to the legislation to make that absolutely clear.
I think you do. So
I get that, if you allow me the ability to consider it. But it may be that I absolutely agree with you, so I'm just taking the time to properly consider it.
Okay, there was some evidence we had from SCVO in terms of the correspondence that was sent to the First Minister about the need to have a community-based information campaign, a funded one. And I just wondered whether or not you've had a chance to see that piece of evidence from the SCVO and what you're...
I haven't seen that particular piece of evidence, so I'm
okay, well,
happy to...
Maybe want to consider that,
yeah,
and come back to us. Rob Gibson.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to turn to the issue about the Electoral Commission's recommendation that the UK and Scottish Government should clarify what process will follow the referendum in sufficient detail to inform people what will happen if most voters vote yes and what will happen if most voters vote no. What discussions have you had with the UK Government about what will follow the vote?
There are discussions ongoing between my officials and counterparts in the UK Government about what a statement of that nature might look like. I thought the Electoral Commission's recommendation in that regard was sensible. I think just as we were right to accept the recommendations on spending and the wording of the question, I think there's a duty on both governments to accept the recommendation in this regard as well. Those discussions have not concluded yet. I'd be happy to report back to the committee when those discussions reach a conclusion.
There was also some correspondence we had from Better Together, a suggestion that there was discussions going on between the two governments and correspondence about the issue of providing the Commission with an agreed wording on the basics of what happens after the referendum and in terms of promoting the understanding of the question. In terms of these discussions that are going on, it's the same.
That's the discussion I've just referred to in terms of, okay. I don't know what the No campaign were referring to in the evidence they gave to you, but the discussions that I'm talking about are the discussions I've just spoken about in response to Rob Gibson. Any other questions? If there are no other questions, can I thank you, Deputy First Minister, and our officials for attending today and giving us some useful evidence for our report purposes. That lets us move on to the next meeting, which is scheduled for Thursday the 20th of June, when the committee will review the evidence taken on the referendum bill. As previously agreed, that will take place in private. Can I suggest, as part of that process, we also write to the Electoral Commission on its view, because some of it's been raised today, particularly in the Better Together suggestion about including these short statements from both the yes and no campaigns on an information leaflet, just to see if we can get something back in time to help us inform our decision making. And can I remind members that they may now lodge Stage 3 amendments for the franchise bill, and the Parliament's agreed that Stage 3 should be on Thursday the 27th of June. So the deadline for lodging amendments is 4:30 p.m. on Friday the 21st of June. And with that,
it was just to ask, Convener, when we'll have the comparative information between Westminster rules and Holyrood rules.
I did write. It will be circulated before the next meeting.
Oh, good.
Good. Okay, I'll formally close the meeting. Thank you very much, colleagues.